My name is Jenna, and for most of my life, Christmas used to feel simple, predictable, safe. But this year, it became the night everything snapped in half. I drove 2 hours back to the trailer park I grew up in, holding a small wrapped gift in my lap. I hadn't been home in a while, so I told myself this would be the moment things finally felt normal again. You know how you rehearse what you'll say, how you'll smile, how you'll pretend nothing has been strange for years? Yeah, I tried that too. When I walked up to the front steps and knocked, the door opened faster than I expected. And there she was, my aunt, staring at me like I'd tracked dirt across her brand new floor. She didn't blink. She didn't smile. She just rolled her eyes, leaned closer, and hissed, "Get out of here, you filthy thing!" Then she pulled the door half open, just enough for me to see inside. My entire family was gathered around the table, laughing, eating, passing dishes, acting like nothing was wrong, acting like I wasn't supposed to exist there at all. No one looked up. No one called my name. No one even flinched. So I nodded once, whispered, "Got it," and turned around. But the moment I reached my car, my phone lit up. One call after another. And 10 minutes later, my dad was pounding on my door, breathless and shaking, demanding to know, "What happened? What is this?" He had no idea that everything was about to unravel. Before I tell you what came next, and trust me, it gets worse, make sure you follow the channel so you don't miss stories like this. Now, let's go back to that night. Silence filled the car so completely it felt like another passenger. I drove on instinct, hands steady on the wheel while my thoughts refused to come into focus. The street where everything had just happened dropped away behind me, then the homes, then most of the light. I did not have a plan. I only knew that going forward hurt slightly less than turning around. Somewhere along that stretch, my phone started buzzing in the cup holder. The same name lit up the screen again and again. I let it ring out once, twice, more times than I could count. I was not ready for anyone's soft words or hard questions, not ready to hear that I had misunderstood, that what I felt was too much. I had heard some version of that for years. The buzzing did not stop. Missed calls stacked into a small column. A voicemail icon appeared, then another incoming call pushed over it. Whoever was on the other end was not giving up. The persistence cracked something in the numb shell I had pulled over myself. People who are finished with you do not fight that hard to get through. That simple truth lodged in my chest and would not move. At the next turnoff, I pulled into an empty strip of pavement beside a dark storefront and shifted into park. The engine ticked as it cooled. I sat there with my fingers still wrapped around the steering wheel, as if letting go would make everything fall apart faster. When the phone started buzzing again, I snatched it up before the sound could fill the space and lifted it to my ear. Noise hit me first, breathing that came too fast, a door slamming. Voices in the background raised in a tight, panicked way that had nothing to do with celebration. Then the words separated themselves. Questions, rapid and uneven. But for once, they were not accusations aimed at me. There was confusion, disbelief, anger that clearly was not pointed in my direction. It sounded like someone had just watched the same scene I had lived and could not make it fit into the story they thought they knew. I stayed quiet longer than politeness would allow. Part of me wanted to hang up and crawl back into the brittle safety of being alone, where at least nobody could disappoint me further. Another part recognized that whatever had cracked back there was still echoing through the person on the line. They were not defending what had happened. They were stumbling over it, tripping on details that refused to add up. That was new, and it scared me almost as much as the cruelty itself. I heard a car door open on their end, then the quick scrape of footsteps on gravel. The voice told me not to drive any farther, that they were already on the road, coming to where I was. I did not say I would stay, but I also did not turn the key. I let the phone drop into my lap and watched the glowing numbers on the dashboard slide forward, one slow minute at a time while my thoughts slid backward. They went to the last few years. Messages that never got a reply. Family photos where I was the only one missing and nobody wondered aloud why. Invitations that arrived too late to be real options. Holidays where I told myself I preferred eating alone, because at least then I could breathe, without feeling judged. I had treated each moment like a separate sting. Sitting in that parked car, I felt them connect into something more like a design. Headlights swept across the lot and another car pulled in beside mine. I knew the outline immediately, and the recognition sent a knot of relief and resentment into my throat at the same time. The engine cut off. A door opened. A familiar figure stepped out, moving with an urgency that did not match the calm, steady image I had assumed for that evening. Up close, the face in the harsh light looked older than the one in my memory. More lines, more strain, a kind of raw shock that did not look staged. They came to my window and stopped. I lowered it halfway, leaving a strip of glass between us because I was not ready to let anyone all the way in. Their eyes moved over my face as if checking for damage. As they spoke, the pieces came out in short bursts. An empty chair, a remark that sounded wrong, a walk to the front expecting to find me close by. The surprise of discovering I was already gone. Speaking it seemed to hit them harder than living it had. I let their words fill the air. For years I had assumed that silence at that table meant consent, that nobody objected because everyone quietly agreed I deserved the distance. Now I was looking at someone who clearly had not understood what was being done in their name until it spilled into something undeniable. Then they mentioned going back to the kitchen, opening one of those drawers every home has, the one full of keys and rubber bands and forgotten things. Sitting on top of the clutter was an envelope that did not belong there, with my name written on the front in a hand we both knew too well. By the time that detail reached me, their hand was no longer empty. They were holding something thin and white, edges softened by time, like it had been picked up and put back more than once without ever crossing the small distance to where I sat now. They did not have to say whose handwriting it was. I recognized my mother's loops from where I was. The parking lot, the cars, the cold air slipping through the gap in the window. All of it blurred. All I could see was that envelope, and the short stretch of space between their fingers and mine. Beneath the anger and humiliation that had filled me all night, another feeling pushed its way up, a raw old hunger I had learned to organize my life around since the day we buried her. Whatever was inside that paper had been meant for me. Someone had decided I did not need to see it. In that moment, with my name staring back at me in familiar ink, the meaning of the night shifted. It was no longer only about being turned away from a holiday meal. It was about finally seeing how long the door had been closing on me, inch by inch, long before anyone bothered to slam it shut. The envelope rested in my hands with a weight that felt far heavier than paper. For a long moment, I couldn't bring myself to open it. My fingers pressed against the sealed edge while a pressure built behind my ribs, tight and unfamiliar, as if my body wasn't sure whether to brace for comfort or collapse. Grief does strange things when it returns after years of being pushed aside. It arrives quietly, then spreads fast, filling every place I thought had hardened enough to hold. I slid a thumb under the flap and felt it tear. The sound seemed too loud for the small space, too intimate for the cold night leaking in through the open window. Inside was a folded sheet, creased from time but carefully kept. My mother's handwriting curved across the page with the same soft loops she used on birthday cards and school notes. Seeing it again struck me harder than any insult or cold shoulder ever had. It reached deeper, to a place no one else had managed to touch. I started reading. The first few lines carried her voice as clearly as if she were sitting beside me, the way she used to on nights when I couldn't sleep. She wrote about loving me in ways she never fully knew how to say aloud. She wrote about being proud of the choices I made, even when they confused other people. She wrote about the strength she hoped I would find after she was gone. Then the tone shifted. Her words grew heavier, more deliberate, like she had struggled over them. She spoke of tension inside the family, of whispered judgments she wished she could have shielded me from. She wrote about a growing worry that someone close to us might reshape things in her absence, pushing me further from the home she wanted me to feel welcome in. She didn't name anyone directly, but the implication pressed against the page so clearly that I didn't need her to finish the thought. My throat tightened as each sentence stacked on top of the last. The letter didn't just acknowledge my hurt, she had predicted it. She knew something was wrong before she left this world, and she tried to keep it from reaching me. Her last lines felt like a hand closing gently around my own, a plea for me not to shrink to fit the limits others created, a reminder that love should never be conditional on convenience. By the time I reached the end, my chest felt scraped raw. Not from sadness alone, but from recognition. I had spent years wondering whether I had imagined the distance, whether I had misread the coldness that settled into my family after she passed. I tried so hard to rationalize it, telling myself life gets busy, people change, grief complicates everything. Yet here was proof that none of it had been in my head. Someone else had seen it forming long before it became unbearable. Someone who had every reason to tell me the truth, gently chose to write it plainly so I wouldn't question it later. The paper trembled in my hands, not from the air, but from the shift happening inside me. A slow, steady recognition of what this night truly meant. The cruelty earlier had not been a moment of heat or misunderstanding. It had been part of a pattern, a long, careful shaping of a narrative where I became an outsider, where my absence was easier for them to accept than my presence. For years, I internalized the idea that maybe I deserved that distance, that I failed at something fundamental, that I wasn't the kind of daughter or niece or cousin people wanted around. The letter fractured that belief in one clean cut. If my mother saw what was coming, then the fault had never been mine. The hurt was real. The betrayal was intentional. And the people who claimed to love her had ignored what she wanted most. I leaned back in the seat and stared at the words again. The lines blurred at the edges, but I didn't blink them away. Letting myself feel the entire weight of her message was the closest I had come to hearing her speak in years. Every sentence carried the familiar warmth she used to wrap around me, the warmth I had been starved for, without even realizing how cold everything else had become. The truth settled into place slowly, like a heavy stone sinking toward the bottom of a lake. I could no longer move through my life pretending this was all accidental. There had been choices, deliberate ones, made without me but affecting me all the same. And now that I finally understood the depth of it, I couldn't keep drifting around the edges of the family, hoping someone would notice the hole they carved. Something inside me straightened, not confidence exactly, but clarity. A line drawn through years of confusion, a shift from wondering what I had done wrong to understanding exactly what had been done to me. The letter rested on my lap as I closed my eyes and took one slow breath. The decision formed itself without struggle. I needed to face the people who created this fracture. Not to fix anything, not to salvage relationships, but to speak truth into a room that had spent too long rearranging it. I folded the letter carefully, smoothing the creases with my palm. The paper felt fragile, but the message inside it was not. It braced me in a way nothing else could have. It reminded me that silence had already cost me too much. Outside the car, headlights cut across the lot. The figure approaching belonged to someone who had finally seen what denial had hidden. Someone who had chosen, even if too late, to step into the truth with me. I didn't know what conversation waited ahead or how deep the damage ran, but I did know this. The door that had slammed shut earlier wasn't the last one I would walk toward tonight. I opened the car door and stepped into the cold air, holding the letter close. Whatever came next would begin with this piece of paper, this final gift, this undeniable proof that my mother believed in me long after everyone else stopped trying to understand me. And for the first time in a long time, I felt the faintest spark of something steady and unshakable taking root beneath the ache. The wind cut across my face as I stepped away from the safety of the car, but the cold barely registered. Something else had taken over, something steadier than anger and sharper than sadness. I felt it settle in my spine as I moved toward the other vehicle, a quiet resolve that refused to loosen its grip. The letter had changed the shape of the night, but the path forward was forming in a way that no longer frightened me. The parking lot was nearly empty, just two cars facing each other under a flickering streetlight. My steps sounded too loud on the cracked pavement, though the rest of the world seemed muted, as if the snow in the air had swallowed every unnecessary sound. I approached slowly, aware that everything from here on would reshape the narrative that had been forced around me for years. Once a truth is spoken aloud, it cannot be folded back into silence. When I reached the front of my car, I paused. A part of me hesitated, not out of fear, but from the weight of clarity. Crossing this space meant crossing a threshold, one I couldn't return from. I let the thought settle. I wasn't walking toward reconciliation. I wasn't seeking comfort. I was choosing to confront a story rewritten without my consent, and I would not soften myself to make the truth easier for others to swallow. I lifted the letter and held it against my chest for a moment, almost as if grounding myself in its presence. The paper felt warm despite the cold, carrying the softness of hands I hadn't held in years. It reminded me that this confrontation wasn't born from pettiness or spite. It came from a promise she had made in ink and love, a promise I had the responsibility to honor. If she had trusted me with her truth, then I couldn't keep living a version sculpted by people who resented what she saw in me. My thoughts shifted to the house I had left behind. I pictured the warm lighting, the clatter of dishes, the practiced joy that floated around the table like a staged production. I imagined the moment they realized I wasn't coming back, the moment confusion cracked through the curated image they wore during the holidays. And then I imagined something else, awareness creeping in, guilt brushing against denial, tension building in ways they could no longer ignore. For once, the discomfort was theirs to manage, not mine. Standing there, I felt years of swallowed words stack against each other until they formed a structure strong enough to stand on. I had spent so long shrinking myself to keep the peace that the idea of expanding back into my full shape felt almost foreign. But the night had pushed me past hesitation. I could feel myself reclaiming space with every breath. The snow thickened, drifting over the pavement in slow spirals. The moment felt suspended, as if the air itself waited for me to move. I reminded myself that I didn't need permission. I had spent my life waiting for someone to invite me back into a room I already belonged in. That version of me no longer existed. The letter had pulled her out by the roots. I slipped the paper into my coat, smoothing the edge to keep it safe. Then I straightened, letting my shoulders settle into a posture I didn't recognize at first, one that resembled strength. I wasn't sure where it had come from. Maybe it had always been there, buried beneath years of trying to justify what could never be justified. A quiet certainty pushed me from reflection into action. I turned toward the car behind mine, aware of the figure waiting inside, aware that another conversation would come next. It would not be easy. It would not be gentle. But it no longer felt like a burden. It felt like necessity. As I approached, I imagined the house again, imagined the tension simmering beneath its holiday decorations. Every year that place had wrapped itself in bright colors to hide fractures beneath the surface. Tonight, those cracks had finally shown, sharp enough to cut through years of pretense, and I felt no obligation to smooth them over. Some truths needed to break open before healing had a chance to begin. The car door opened before I reached it. I could sense unease radiating from the shape inside, but I didn't let it sway me. Unease wasn't mine to carry anymore. I stopped beside the open door, feeling the cold slip into the space between us. The letter weighed gently against my chest, steadying me. The night no longer felt quiet. It felt suspended, like the moment before a storm breaks. I could sense old patterns crumbling, the ones built from whispered judgments, quiet exclusions, rewritten memories. They had held power over me for far too long. With the truth now in my hands, their grip had loosened. I didn't sit down. I didn't lean against the car. I simply stood with the certainty that this confrontation would shape everything that came next. I could see a reflection of myself faintly in the window, a version that no longer flinched from being seen. For the first time in years, I looked like someone who belonged to herself. My mother had asked me in her letter not to let anyone make me small again. That line pulsed through me now, warm and fierce, grounding every thought that came after. I realized then that returning to that house was no longer about demanding space at a table that never had room for me. It was about standing in the truth she left behind and refusing to let it be buried again. I inhaled once, slow and steady, letting that promise fill my lungs. The cold felt different now, not punishing, but clarifying. I reached for the car door handle, holding it without pulling, allowing the moment to anchor itself fully. What waited beyond this night would be harsh. It would be messy. It would expose people who had relied on shadows to justify their actions. But the clarity I carried was stronger than the chaos they created. And I felt ready, finally, unquestionably ready, to walk straight into the center of it. With the letter pressed close to my heart, I stepped back and turned toward the road that led to the house. Whatever waited inside, I would meet it without shrinking. The drive back toward the neighborhood felt unreal, as if the roads had stretched into something longer and quieter than they were earlier. Streetlights rolled past in slow intervals, each one casting a brief glow across the windshield before fading again. I kept my hands steady on the wheel, though a restless energy threaded through my nerves, tightening everything inside me. The decision to return had settled firmly into place, but the weight of what waited ahead pressed against my chest with every passing mile. The houses grew closer together as I turned onto familiar streets. Holiday lights blinked across eaves and railings, small, cheerful reminders of a kind of warmth I hadn't felt in years. I drove past them without letting myself take comfort in their glow. My path wasn't leading toward celebration. It was leading toward truth, toward the kind that doesn't soften itself for anyone's comfort. I could feel the letter inside my coat pocket like a steady heartbeat. It grounded me more than any reassurance could. As I neared the driveway, my pulse shifted into something sharp and fast. The house looked almost unchanged from when I'd left. Windows lit, shadows moving faintly behind curtains, the world inside continuing without me. Yet the air carried a tension I could sense from the street, a heaviness that clung to the place like a storm cloud waiting to break. I parked at the curb and turned off the engine, letting the sudden quiet settle over me. Nothing moved. Even the wind had stilled. I stepped out slowly, my boots pressing into the thin layer of snow that had started to gather. The crunch beneath my feet echoed louder than I expected, each sound sending me further into the moment I had been preparing for. The walkway stretched ahead, lined with small lights that flickered under the cold. I followed it with measured steps, feeling the weight of years pressing behind me and the clarity of this night pulling me forward. The front door looked deceptively ordinary. For most of my life, it had been the threshold to safety, celebration, connection. Over time, it had become the entrance to something else: expectation, comparison, quiet judgment that didn't look sharp until you were close enough to feel it. Standing in front of it now, I felt none of the longing I used to drag around with me. The ache had been replaced with something sharper, cleaner. The truth had stripped away everything unnecessary. Before lifting my hand to the door, I paused. The air felt charged, as if the entire house were holding its breath. I let the moment settle, reminding myself that I wasn't stepping into a room searching for acceptance. I wasn't hoping to be understood. I was carrying a truth that had been hidden from me for years, and I would not let it be dismissed again. The letter inside my coat pressed lightly against my ribs, a silent reminder of why this mattered. I stepped inside. The warmth from the house washed over me immediately, but it didn't reach deep enough to thaw anything. The rooms ahead were lit with soft yellow light, casting long shadows along the walls. I scanned the space, noting the stillness in the air, the faint shift of movement deeper inside. The place felt paused, suspended between the memory of celebration and the reality of everything that had fractured beneath it. I moved forward, my footsteps soft against the floor. The hallway stretched ahead, leading toward the heart of the house. I felt every memory etched into its edges, moments both warm and sharp, all woven into a history I had spent too long trying to make sense of. Tonight, I didn't need to make sense of anything. I only needed to face it. As I approached the living room doorway, a tightness spread through my chest. Not from fear, but from anticipation. The room beyond held the people who had shaped the story I was returning to dismantle. They had crafted their version carefully over the years, smoothing the edges of their choices until they almost appeared harmless. But the cracks were visible now, sharp and undeniable. I stepped into the frame of the doorway without hesitation. The room was lit brightly, revealing faces drawn with tension. I took in the scene in one steady sweep, the table still set, the remnants of a celebration abandoned mid-moment, the uneasy shift of bodies trying to decide what to do next. I recognized the atmosphere instantly. It was the charged quiet that settles when the truth has already been exposed, but the consequences have not yet arrived. Standing there, I felt strangely calm. This was not a moment built from rage. It was built from clarity, from understanding exactly what had been taken from me and what I was choosing to reclaim. I moved farther into the room, the letter inside my coat moving with me like a second pulse. The weight of their eyes settled on me, a mixture of shock, tension, and something that looked almost like fear. It didn't shake me, it steadied me. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. I let it settle completely before I braced myself for the next steps. Everything ahead would require a level of clarity I hadn't possessed in years. But tonight, clarity was the one thing I carried without hesitation. I wasn't here to negotiate or soothe or shrink. I was here to stand in the truth that had been hidden from me and refuse to let it be buried again. I positioned myself near the center of the room, grounding my feet as if anchoring myself to the floor. Every shift in the air felt sharper, every breath slower and deeper. This was the moment where the shape of my life would change, not because of what they did or didn't say, but because of what I now understood. I no longer needed their version of family to define me. I reached into my coat and touched the folded paper, feeling its edges beneath my fingertips. The promise inside it echoed through me, quiet, firm, unbreakable. Whatever happened next, I was ready. The shift in the room settled over me the moment I moved past the threshold. It wasn't sudden or dramatic, just a slow tightening of the air, like the moment before a storm breaks, when everything feels overly still. I could sense the weight of unspoken tension pressing against the walls, but my steps remained steady as I crossed the floor. I didn't feel small anymore. I didn't feel outnumbered. I felt anchored by a truth that none of them could rewrite. I stopped near the dining table close enough to feel the heat still lingering from the food, though no one seemed interested in eating anymore. Plates sat half-finished, drinks untouched, chairs pushed back in ways that suggested people had risen too quickly. The entire scene looked frozen, as if the night had paused itself the moment I stepped away earlier. I let my gaze move across the room without pausing on any one face. I didn't need to. I could feel the weight of every stare on me. This time, however, I didn't let that weight settle into my shoulders. I let it fall to the floor where it belonged. A quiet certainty spread through my chest. I reached into my coat and touched the letter gently, not pulling it out yet, just letting the paper remind me why I had returned. That single page had undone years of confusion in a matter of minutes. It had also forced me to confront something far more painful than the cruelty of the night. The realization that I had spent years trying to make space for myself in a family that never intended to let me in. The awareness didn't hollow me out the way I might have expected. Instead, it strengthened something inside me, something that had been shrinking for far too long. I let that feeling sharpen as I stood there, letting the silence stretch long enough for the discomfort to deepen. I wasn't here to soothe it. I wasn't here to make anything easier. I was here to acknowledge exactly what this room had become for me, a place where truth went to be buried. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, but I didn't let myself shrink away from it. Instead, I allowed the tension to settle around me, letting the cold clarity from outside bleed back into my thoughts. It wasn't fear that gripped me now. It was resolve. Every year had layered another weight on my shoulders, but tonight those layers had peeled away one by one. I lifted the letter from my coat slowly, holding it between my fingers with the care it deserved. This piece of paper had carried a message that was meant to guide me, protect me, and keep me from losing myself in a narrative that wasn't mine. Seeing it in my hand now felt like reclaiming a part of my life that had been taken before I even realized it was gone. As I looked at the folded page, I felt a shift inside me. Something final, something irreversible. I knew the truth it held couldn't stay within these walls anymore, not under the same roof that had been used to justify my exclusion. It wasn't anger driving me. It was a kind of quiet justice, the kind that doesn't shout but speaks in a steady, undeniable tone. I moved toward the table, letting the sound of my footsteps cut through the thick air. I placed the letter gently on the smooth surface, setting it where it could no longer be hidden or dismissed. The paper looked impossibly small against the expanse of the table, yet I knew it carried enough weight to alter every comfortable lie that had been allowed to grow here. As I stepped back, I felt the edges of my resolve sharpen. I could sense the shifting energy behind me, but I didn't turn to meet it. I didn't need to. The truth had already changed the room the moment I set the letter down. I stood straighter, breathing in the charged air as if drawing strength from the storm that had been building for years. Time seemed to stretch in a strange, silent way. The house around me felt unfamiliar, almost hostile, as if the walls themselves rejected the presence of the truth now resting on the table. It struck me then how long I had been bending myself to fit into a narrative that never had space for me. The realization didn't hurt. It clarified everything. I reached for my coat zipper, pulling it up in one smooth motion. The movement felt symbolic, a closing of something I had kept open for far too long. I scanned the room one final time, not to search for permission or apology, but to engrave the moment into my memory. I wanted to remember the exact shape of this night, the exact weight of the decision I was making. The doorway behind me felt like the exit to a life I had been trying to belong to. I walked toward it without hesitation. Each step released something from my chest, something I had carried since I was young enough to believe that belonging should be earned. By the time I reached the entrance hall, I felt lighter than I had in years. At the door, I paused. Not for them, but for myself. I let the clarity of the night settle fully into my bones. I wasn't stepping away because I was defeated. I was stepping away because I had finally understood that staying would require the kind of self-betrayal I refused to repeat ever again. The cold air rushed in as I opened the door, wrapping around me like a clean slate. I stepped outside, letting the warmth of the house fall away behind me. The snow had thickened, swirling in the streetlights as if the world were rearranging itself to match the shift inside me. I didn't look back. There was nothing left in that house that could offer me anything worth returning for. I walked toward my car with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. The truth was no longer hidden. The story no longer belonged to the people who tried to bury it. It belonged to me now, and I intended to carry it into a future where I no longer had to shrink, apologize, or wait for anyone to make space for me. The door of the house closed behind me, sealing off a chapter that had already ended long before tonight. And for the first time in a long time, the cold air felt like freedom. Snow thickened on the windshield as I pulled away from the curb, but the road ahead felt clearer than it ever had. There was no hesitation left, no lingering hope that anything inside that house could still be salvaged. The night had stripped away every illusion I once clung to, and what remained was a kind of freedom that didn't rush in loudly. It settled slowly, like warmth returning after a long freeze. I drove without any real destination, letting the quiet hum of the engine hold the pieces of my thoughts in place. The events of the night drifted through my mind in fragments, sharp, distinct, but no longer overwhelming. The clarity felt strange at first, as if my mind didn't quite trust this new space. Yet it kept expanding, making room for truths I had spent years suppressing. At a red light, I breathed out a long, steady breath. Something inside me had finally stopped twisting itself around other people's comfort. I wondered why I had spent so many years trying to be someone they could accept. I had grown used to fighting for scraps of belonging, convinced that endurance would eventually earn me a place. But the letter had cut through all of that. It reminded me that I had been worthy long before they ever decided otherwise. The light turned green, and I continued down the quiet road. I thought about what might be happening back at the house now. The truth resting on that table would force cracks through everything they had built to excuse their behavior. Their carefully curated image of unity had always depended on silence. My silence. Without it, their structure couldn't hold. I imagined the looks on their faces as they confronted what they had hidden. Shock first, then discomfort, then the slow realization that their choices had consequences beyond irritation or gossip. Though I wasn't there to witness it, I could almost feel the unraveling from miles away. The weight no longer belonged to me. It had shifted back to the hands that created it. The road opened into a long stretch bordered by darkened shops and empty sidewalks. The snow softened the harsh lines of everything around me, giving the world a muted glow. I felt strangely calm, as if the cold outside had pulled tension from my body 1 degree at a time. My life had just split into a before and after, and I wasn't afraid of the dividing line. When I reached the outskirts of town, I pulled into an empty parking lot overlooking a frozen field. I cut the engine and let silence fill the space around me. Without the steady hum of the car, the weight of the night settled differently, less like a burden, more like closure. I took out the letter again, holding it gently as its edges caught the dim light. Reading it once had changed everything. Holding it now grounded me in a way nothing else could. It wasn't just a message from the past. It was a reminder that the parts of me they tried to erase were the very parts she loved most. I sat there for a long time, letting her words settle deeper into the spaces that had once held doubt. The emptiness I feared didn't come. Instead, a quiet strength began to anchor itself where the hurt used to live. Eventually, I slid the letter back into my coat and leaned my head against the seat. Somewhere in the distance, the horizon began to brighten just enough to hint at morning. The night was ending, and for the first time in years, it felt like something was truly ending with it. I thought about the future. Not with anxiety, but with a cautious kind of hope. There would be no more waiting for them to change. No more shrinking myself to fit into the narrow spaces they allowed. I didn't need their acceptance to build a life worth living. I never had. The consequences waiting for them would unfold without my involvement. The truth had a way of spreading once it was exposed, and people who relied on secrecy rarely handled exposure well. I knew the weight of the letter would fracture their alliances, strain their excuses, and force them to confront the harm they had dismissed for years. That was no longer my burden. I breathed out slowly, letting the night finally release its grip on me. My hands felt steady. My mind felt clear. I had walked away from the version of myself who once begged to be seen, and I didn't plan to return to her. Strength grows quietly when you stop apologizing for your existence. As the sky brightened, I stepped out of the car. The cold bit at my cheeks, but it didn't sting the way it had earlier. I crossed my arms and stood there for a moment, watching the faint glow stretch across the horizon. It felt like a beginning, not the polished kind people write into fairy tales, but a raw, honest start built from truth instead of denial. I thought of my mother again. Not with grief, but with a strange, comforting certainty. Her words had reached me exactly when I needed them, even after all the attempts to keep them buried. She had given me permission to stop chasing a love that demanded my silence. She had given me the strength to choose myself. And standing there in the cold, I understood the lesson she had hoped I would carry beyond her lifetime. Family is not measured by blood, or by shared tables, or by the stories others decide to tell about you. Family is measured by who protects your truth, who honors your voice, and who refuses to let you disappear inside their version of you. I didn't walk away from them tonight. I walked back to myself. And that was the first step toward a life where I would never be made small again.